4,000 Zulu warriors are marching on a farmhouse held by barely 150 men. The defenders can already see their dust rising over the hills. There is no way out, and no help is coming. It is the afternoon of the 22nd of January, 1879, at a river crossing in southern Africa called Rorke's Drift. What happens here over the next 15 hours will become one of the most famous last stands in history. To understand how 150 men ended up facing 4,000, you have to go back only a few hours to a mountain a few miles away, where that morning a British army was wiped from the earth. Britain had invaded the Zulu kingdom, confident that rifles and discipline would sweep aside an army of spears. That morning, at a place called Isandlwana, they learned how wrong they were. A Zulu army 20,000 strong had surrounded and destroyed a British column of more than 1,300 men. It was one of the worst defeats the British army had ever suffered against a foe they had dismissed. These were not a disorganized mob. For 60 years, the Zulu had been the most feared army in southern Africa. They fought in disciplined regiments, carried a short stabbing spear made for close killing, and swept around their enemies in a formation shaped like the horns of a charging bull. But not every Zulu regiment had fought. A reserve of some 4,000 warriors had been held back, and they were hungry for a battle of their own. They looked across the river toward a tiny British outpost and began to march. They were led by a half-brother of the Zulu king, a prince eager for a victory to call his own. The king had ordered his regiments not to attack the British, where they stood fortified behind walls. The prince chose to ignore him. At Rorke's Drift, the day had been quiet. The station was a supply depot and a hospital, a couple of stone buildings by the river. Its garrison was small, and many of the men inside were sick or injured, lying on cots. In command were two young lieutenants, John Shard, an engineer sent to fix the river pontoons, and Gonville Bromhead, an infantry officer, hard of hearing, who led the small company of redcoats stationed there. Early that afternoon, two riders came galloping in, survivors from the disaster. Their message was simple and terrible. The main army was gone, and thousands of victorious Zulus were coming straight for Rorke's Drift. For a moment, there was a terrible choice. Some argued they should abandon the station and run for the nearest town, 13 miles away. But a wagon of sick men could never outrun a Zulu regiment on foot. To run was to be caught in the open and slaughtered. It was a supply officer named James Dalton who made the case that saved them. "Do not run," he argued. "Stay and turn these stone buildings into a fortress." Shard agreed. They would fight where they stood. Now the clock became the enemy. They had perhaps an hour before the Zulus arrived, and almost nothing to build with. So they used what a supply depot had: grain. They dragged 200-pound sacks of maize and heavy wooden biscuit boxes into a low wall, linking the two buildings and the stone cattle pen into one connected perimeter. Every man not on watch heaved and stacked until his arms gave out. By 4:30, the barricade was barely finished. The redcoats climbed to their places along the wall, loaded their rifles, and waited. And then, over the ridge to the south, the hills themselves seemed to move. The first wave came at a run. Hundreds of warriors sprinting toward the south wall, shields high, spears ready. The British rifles opened up in a rolling crash, and the front rank of the charge fell. But behind them came hundreds more. This was the Zulu way of war. Wave after wave, probing every side at once, searching for the one weak point where numbers could pour through. The little garrison had to be strong everywhere, all at the same time. The fighting became close and desperate. Where the walls were low, warriors and soldiers grappled hand to hand, spear against bayonet, across the sacks of grain. Dalton, the man who had urged them to stay, was shot and badly wounded. As darkness fell, the Zulus set their sights on the weakest point of all: the hospital. It was a low building full of sick men, with a thatched roof, and thatch burns. Warriors rushed the hospital and forced their way against the doors. Inside, a handful of privates found themselves trapped with a room full of patients who could not walk, and no way to carry them out the front. So they made their own way out. With bayonets and bare hands, They knocked holes straight through the interior mud walls and began dragging the wounded from room to room, one man at a time, deeper into the building, away from the spears. Then the thatch caught fire. Whether by a torch or a spark, the hospital roof went up, and the trapped men now had flames above them as well as spears at the door. The burning building lit the whole battlefield a hellish orange. By the firelight, the last patients were pulled out through a high window and carried across open ground to the main position, hands reaching up to catch them. Some of the men who held that room to the end would not make it out. But most of the sick were saved. With the hospital lost, Chard pulled his surviving men back behind a smaller wall, a tight square of grain sacks in front of the storehouse. If you have been holding on, a quick tap of the like button genuinely helps a story like this one reach more people who would want to hear it. Now came the longest part of the night. For hours in the dark, the Zulus attacked the little redoubt again and again. The men fired until their rifle barrels were too hot to hold, and then they fired some more. A chaplain moved calmly along the wall in the middle of it all, handing out cartridges from a bag and speaking quietly to the men, telling them not to swear, only to shoot straight. Ammunition ran low. Still, the wall held. Again and again, the Zulus reached the very top of the sacks, and again the bayonets threw them back. Neither side would break. The exhausted defenders fought on by the light of their own burning hospital. Among the defenders were men whose courage became legend. A corporal from Switzerland, shot through the foot, who limped back to the wall and fought on. Ordinary privates who stood in the gap where the fighting was hottest, and would not give an inch. Hour after hour it went on, past midnight, into the small hours. And then, slowly, the attacks began to weaken. The waves came less often. The warriors, too, were exhausted, and they had left thousands of their own on the ground. As the sky began to gray toward dawn, the firing died away, and an eerie silence fell over Rorke's drift. The defenders stood at their wall, black with smoke, barely able to believe they were still alive. Then, in the full light of morning, a great body of Zulus appeared once more on the hills. The tired men reached for their rifles, certain the end had finally come, but the warriors did not attack. They looked at the little fort, and then they simply turned and walked away. Soon after, a relief column appeared on the road, expecting to find nothing but ashes and the dead. Instead, they found the exhausted garrison standing among the smoking ruins, their wall unbroken, still holding Rorke's drift. In the full light, the defenders walked out beyond their broken wall to a silent, terrible field. They gathered their own dead, and they buried the fallen where they lay. Then they stood in the quiet and began to understand what they had survived. The numbers of that night are hard to believe. Just over 150 men, many of them sick, had held off an army of 3,000 to 4,000. 17 of the defenders were dead. Around them lay hundreds upon hundreds of the fallen. For the defense of that little station, 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded, the highest honor for valor in the British military. It remains the most ever given for a single action to this day. History has argued about Rorke's drift ever since. Some say it was a magnificent stand. Others that it was made much of on purpose, a shining story rushed out to soften the shame of the disaster at Isandlwana that same day. Both things can be true. The wider war was a British invasion of a kingdom that had done them no wrong, and within months the Zulu nation would be broken. But on that one night, at that one wall, a small group of frightened men did something extraordinary and simply refused to fall. That is why, a century and a half later, we still tell the story of Rorke's drift. If stories of history's great stands are what you come here for, subscribe and stay with us. There is always another one coming.